if you're only paying attention to the battlefield, you're not paying attention to the home front. So you're not paying attention to women. You are not paying attention to 4 million enslaved people who are experiencing this war in a very different way. If you did any Western history, there's that time span, and you really do not talk about it. Whenever you leave people, like large populations, out of those stories, it means you're leaving them out of the American body politic.
We're pleased to be joined by Megan Kate Nelson, a writer, historian, and we're going to discuss a bit about the Civil War, something she's written about in a couple books. But first, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So you wrote a book called The Three-Cornered War that I want to start with, as obviously I think most people traditionally think of it as two corners, like the Union, Confederate, the North, South. So could you kind of just describe for us the three corners you write about in that book?
Absolutely. Yeah. The three corners have a couple of different meanings in the book. The overall argument is that the Civil War was not just about the North and the South. Of course, it was very much about that, but it was also about the West and the future of the West in the nation, and whether Southern slave owners were going to be able to, I'm so sorry. Oh, did you hear that?
I did not.
Okay, there was my phone ringing through my computer. Sorry.
You're fine. No worries.
Okay, I will start over. Okay, all right. The three corners can have a lot of different meanings in the book. One of the major arguments is that the Civil War was most certainly about the North and the South, but it was also about the West. Americans had been arguing over the West for like 10 years. It was the source of all that friction and division in the country. And so when the war began, of course, most Civil War historians are like, no one was thinking about the West anymore. But actually, that's not true, because the West continued to be a concern for both Northerners and Southerners. They both wanted control of it for the future of either the United States or the Confederacy. But it also means the U.S. Army, the Confederate Army, and also Native peoples, who are not often talked about in the American Civil War. But the book is mostly centered in New Mexico and parts of Texas and what is now Arizona, Colorado, and California. And Native peoples, particularly Chiricahua, Apaches, and Navajo peoples, were very much involved in the war in this region. And then also it's the sort of three different groups of Anglos and Hispano-New Mexicans and indigenous peoples. And, we are often talking about the Civil War in the Eastern Theater, where it's mostly white soldiers. And then after 1863, Black soldiers come into the battlefield. But here, these were the most diverse fighting forces in the entire Civil War, involving all three of those groups. So that's three different meanings for the three-cornered war.
Yeah, I'm curious what role these kind of less talked about groups, the Native peoples, the indigenous, the other ones you mentioned, what kind of role did they play, and were they involved from the beginning, or did they kind of just find themselves involved somewhere along the way?
Yeah. Well, Hispanic Mexicans were pretty interesting, right? Because they had just come into the country 10 years before and had been sort of deemed citizens because of their inhabitation of what was now New Mexico territory. But many of them had a bone to pick with the American federal government, right? They had been, trade partners, but also enemies not so long ago. And so the US and the Confederacy were sort of fighting over them a little bit to see which way they were going to go. But most of them threw their lot in with the US Army and the US government. And the first New Mexico was a very large and important army for the United States in its conflict with the Confederates in New Mexico. And they were led by Kit Carson and several other officers, and all Spanish speaking. And they fought in a number of those engagements. And then they also turned and fought against Chiricahua Apaches and Navajos in the second phase of the war. So they were fully involved from the very beginning. Civilians were involved because they were providing food for the Army, and they were for the US Army, and they were hiding food from the Confederates because they did not want to give them anything. And indigenous peoples, it sort of varied. There are a lot of different tribal nations in this region. But for the most part, if you think about it from their perspective, most of the tribal nations in this area are raiding peoples in that they roam pretty widely over territory that they call their own. And at the kind of fringes of those territories are when either indigenous enemies or when Anglos kind of cross those borders, they're fair game, right? So they, attack wagon trains, they attack towns and ranches, and they siphon off sheep and cattle and horses. And if they can get weapons and food, that is great too. And often they would also take women and children as captives. And so think about it from their perspective that suddenly there are thousands of US soldiers like on the road and they're strung out in this big line and they have all these wagons and they have these huge cattle herds and many, many more horses in the region than normal. So it to them, the kind of white man's war in the beginning seemed like this great gift, right? I mean, they were constantly attacking both sides, and both armies were having to deal with them throughout.
So then the conflicts and fighting that was happening in the West seemingly had different motivations kind of than what was happening in the East, or was it like the
Yes.
same they were kind of different then?
It was a little different. I mean, the Confederates, who were all Texans, who had been recruited in order to invade New Mexico territory and hopefully for the Confederates drive all the way to the Pacific and take Southern California,
Mhm.
because they wanted those ports, they wanted gold mines, they wanted access to all of that. Um, they were all Texans, they were all diehard Confederates, and they were carrying the flag of the Confederacy, whether or not they were slave owners themselves. And so they were fully on board, and they truly, truly believed down to a man in the right of white men and women to own and trade in Black men and women. Um, so even though they're fighting in the West and they're fighting against a US Army that's very different than the kind of US armies they're fighting in the East, they're still fighting for that same cause. And they are fighting to expand the Confederacy all the way to the Pacific. So they wanted that as what they thought of as an empire of slavery. And there were some of them that thought, if we can go all the way to the Pacific coast and we can establish ourselves there, maybe we can even go south, we can take over Mexico and parts of the Caribbean and have this sort of hemispheric empire of slavery. So that was the dream for many Confederates and some of the Texans who were in the Sibley Brigade. So they were fighting for some of the same things. Now, the US soldiers were a little different because Hispano New Mexicans were fighting basically to protect their families because it was their home front, right? These two armies are suddenly in their kind of home territory, fighting back and forth and destroying landscapes to some extent. And they felt like they were fighting for the future of not only their own families but their communities in New Mexico. The U.S. soldiers who were in the field, who were Anglos, they were motivated by patriotism to some extent. Some of them were just bored. They had been in the gold mines for a really long time. It was going to be a winter where they weren't going to be doing much. So they figured, why not get paid and fed and maybe have what they perceived to be a little fun, which in fact was not fun at all. Like battle during this century was not at all fun. So yeah, so a lot of different kinds of motivations, pretty complicated because of all the different communities involved.
I'm curious if you think that the way that these kinds of stories kind of, aren't the ones that are told when in the way we remember the Civil War, how it is more North or South. Do you think
Mhm.
these are kind of just, they've been lost in time, things like, Jim Crow, like that, maybe just lead us to talk more of like a different narrative around it? Or do you think it's kind of more of a symptom of the marginalizing that a lot of these groups still face today in America?
It's absolutely that. It's absolutely part of that marginalization. And whenever we create these national narratives that are super important, right, to Americans, the American dream, manifest destiny, All of the stories that we tell about major moments like the American Revolution and the Civil War, um, whenever you leave people, like large populations, out of those stories, it means you're leaving them out of the American body politic, right? And it makes it very easy then to take away their rights, to kind of push them to the margins of the economy. It really is an alienating factor. I think we really underrate and don't really pay much attention to the ways that those stories and those histories really do work in that fashion. And historians are to blame for a lot of this, actually. Civil War historians have, until quite recently, until kind of the late 20th century, the 1980s and 90s, they really have focused on Eastern battlefields. And when you only focus on Eastern battlefields, you're only really talking about white soldiers. And then again, after 1863, kind of smaller companies of Black soldiers. And you're not paying attention if you're only paying attention to the battlefield, you're not paying attention to the home front. So you're not paying attention to women. You are not paying attention to 4 million enslaved people who are experiencing this war in a very different way. Um, and you certainly are not paying attention to anything going on west of the Mississippi River. I mean, if you look at any Civil War history textbook or synthesis history published in recent memory, the map just ends. It sort of ends. There's like a page break in the middle of Texas, and it's like the rest of the 40% of the country doesn't even exist. Because they weren't the sites of major battles. But, my argument is there were actual major battles, which is interesting considering how few soldiers were engaged. I mean, there were only maybe 6,000 to 7,000 soldiers engaged in New Mexico, which, I mean, you think about the enormous armies of the Eastern Theater, hundreds of thousands of men who are engaged. But these 7,000 people were fighting over kind of the future of 40% of the country. So, and territorial conquest is part of warfare, right? I mean, it's one thing to win a battle, but then also you want to march into places and occupy them. So the West is more significant than most Civil War historians have really acknowledged until quite recently. And this is a huge problem. And I should also say historians of the United States West are equally culpable because they just sort of skip over the Civil War. Like if you remember back to your US history in high school, or if you took college classes, if you did any Western history, that there's that time span and you really do not talk about it. But again, because no one thinks that it was significant. But yeah, that point you made earlier, Brandon, is so incredibly true. When people are marginalized in national narratives, in history, then it becomes possible for people in power to marginalize them in fact, like on the ground and in real life.